Okay, so very good. So this looks like a good time to get started. So we're happy to have Swapnika Rachapalli here talking about learning between buyers and sellers in a global supply chain. We have an hour for the talk. The usual rules apply. If you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, just like you would during a regular seminar. And then afterwards, we'll leave the stream open for more questions and comments. So go ahead, you have an hour, take it away.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you all for coming to my talk today, and thank you for having me here today. I'll jump right in and start talking about this paper, which is trying to look at whether firms can learn from each other when they start transacting by buying and selling goods. So the motivation to this paper is coming from two sides. The first part is we know multi-product firms are pretty important players in the economy. There is a lot of papers that have come out that have established that multi-product firms seem to be producing a large share of economic outputs in the economy. And there have been papers that are trying to look at why multi-product firms exist. And most of these go in line of thinking about common inputs being used across products or having public goods that help in the production of multiple products. The second part of the motivation is coming from the international trade and firm innovation literature. And there we've seen that international trade can in fact open up a lot of opportunities for firms to start innovating or introducing new products. And most of these opportunities or most of these stories have gone along the lines of either being, changing incentives for firms to innovate. Like there are import competition pressures that can make firms innovate more or less, or there are export market opportunities that makes firms want to innovate more. What I'm going to do in this paper is try to look at a new channel through which international trade can help in firms to innovate or introduce new products, and then link it back to the multi-product firms literature and try to give a new dimension through which multi-product firms might exist in the economy. So here I'll be looking at a new unexplored channel for product innovation, wherein I see if buyer-seller interactions can help these agents along in this transaction learn about products being produced by each other. I want to set some ideas in mind, so I'll be using an illustrative example that can help in this talk, and I'll fall back upon this example whenever I need to talk about some mechanisms. Think about a leather producer who's supplying leather to a football producer to make footballs, or soccer balls, as people call them here. So in the process of transacting leather, selling his leather to this football manufacturer, can I ask if this leather producer learn about making footballs and start producing footballs himself in the future? And I'm going to be very agnostic about what it is these leather producers can learn, because I'll be looking at a large range of industries. I cannot specifically pinpoint what they learn, but you can think about learning here as anything that can improve the likelihood that you start producing a product. So it could be something it could be all the way from learning about a blueprint about the product, or just learning about how to organize your firm in order to produce a product efficiently that you didn't know before, right? So I'm going to be pretty agnostic about learning here. And what I want to emphasize here is the role of international trade in providing this new access to knowledge that is, produced somewhere else outside of your country and is brought into your country. This is another channel through which knowledge can diffuse through these buyer-seller interactions. This is a quote I like to put in here. This is from the recent World Development Report, and it kind of captures what I'm trying to say in this paper. They say the relational nature of global value chains make them a particularly powerful vehicle for technology transfer along the chain. And here they were talking about some other aspect of technology transfer where buyers of a certain product are in fact telling suppliers how to produce a product for them, and there are certain transfers along the line. But there can be other unintentional transfers as well. There could be other non-strategic transfers that are happening, and that's what I will show today. The first part of the paper, so this paper is going to have two major sections to it. The first part is mostly empirical in nature, and here I'll be establishing certain stylized facts. So I have some novel stylized facts I want to talk about with respect to multi-product producers in India. So I look at the Indian manufacturing sector, and I find that a large fraction of multi-product producers in India are in fact multi-stage producers. In the sense that if there is a leather manufacturer, he is almost certainly likely to produce a football within his factory already. And the second stylized fact is dynamic in nature. And here I find that a large fraction of new products introduced by any plant in the manufacturing sector tends to be vertically related to these previous production baskets. So if there was a leather producer yesterday, he's very likely to introduce a football tomorrow if he's going to introduce a new product. So there is a disproportionately more likely to introduce a vertically related product in the future. So these two stylized facts kind of set the stage for me to ask the next question, which is, why is it that multi-product plants tend to be multi-stage? What is special about producing vertically related products together? And I want to emphasize here that this is not pure vertical integration. These plants are not producing inputs for their own production. They're actually producing all these products for revenue generation, and they're selling it outside of their firms, right? So the question I ask then is, are they learning? Is it more likely for these firms to gather information, to gain knowledge of these vertically related products because they're interacting with producers of these products over time? And in the third part of the empirical analysis, I'll be providing you some causal evidence to show that when firms in India or plants in India are being exposed to new downstream knowledge to produced by foreign firms, they're more likely to introduce new downstream products in the future. So that forms the essence of my empirical analysis.
Swapnika.
Yes, Anna.
Okay, so we have quite a bit of evidence that exporters learn from exporting and they upgrade in several different dimensions. As you said yourself, it may be that firms are just learning how to organize their production better. Very often, the downstream product, as in your example of football, balls, or whatever they call the downstream product has higher value added or is more complex than the original product. So the firm is really, in a sense, upgrading. Can I interpret it that way, or can you look at more industry characteristics, whether it is the case that it's an upgrade when the firm incorporates the downstream product, or it's really about being downstream?
That's a good point. So what I do know is when firms, when they're multi-stage producers, they tend to be adding more value into their production. So they do have more value added. What I haven't looked at is specific product characteristic in terms of value added, and whether that is, those products are more likely to be added. That's a very good point. I should look at that. I will show you some evidence that there is something special about downstream production, and it could be that these are more profitable to produce. They are adding more value, and that makes these plants more, they could capture higher surplus in the production of these products, and that's one of the reasons why they're adding it. But this is coming after a shock to being exposed to foreign markets. Right, this is not just any time that they're adding. There is a higher likelihood of you adding it after you being exposed to your buyers, to better buyers outside of your country, and that's the key that's what I want to emphasize here.
No, absolutely. I don't want to keep you any further.
No, that's fine.
But I was just trying to figure out whether this is just an improvement by exporting, or there's really a new mechanism, something specific about adding downstream products, or it's an example of upgrading by exporting.
It's definitely an example of upgrading specifically downstream through exporting. So I will show you a bunch of results that will hopefully convince you of that story. And yeah. Okay, so the next part of the paper is quantitative in nature, and here I am interested in understanding what these knowledge spillovers mean for aggregate outcomes. So we have these vertical knowledge spillovers, and incumbent firms can learn from each other when they already exist in the market. And in order to do this, I build a quantitative GE model with innovating multi-product, multi-stage producers in the economy. And when they innovate, they're actually drawing ideas from each other. There is technology diffusion across these firms. Firms can learn from each other. And at the end of the talk, I will be showing you some results out of this quantitative model. The first one is to understand what the contribution of these vertical knowledge spillovers actually is on growth. And there are some interesting outcomes here because this is going to be a growth model through where growth is coming out of dynamic selection. Introducing incumbent innovation, especially in a vertical sense, can actually reduce growth because of reduced dynamic selection over time. And I'll tell you exactly how that is happening. The last part of the paper will then look at the effect of trade policy on these firm dynamics. I want to come full circle and go back to looking at what firms look like in the economy. And here, what I will be comparing is balanced growth path equilibria across different trade policy. But one thing to note here is that once you have international trade and when you have opened up economies to interacting with each other, technology gaps between countries have reduced, will converge. And convergence in these technology gaps will have implications for how much knowledge spillovers there does exist for future firm growth and firm innovations. So I'll show you some results with respect to trade dynamics here. Okay, so quickly going through the literature, there's the paper does fall into a bunch of different parts of the literature. The first one is, I'm bringing in this new dimension of product introduction in response to trade shocks for firms in India. The second major important literature I do contribute to is this new dimension of multi-product producers in the economy. And I'm going to show you how multi-stage producers are in fact a little more important in the economy than an average multi-product plant here. And the last two parts is, the value chains and technology diffusion literature that is upcoming and the trade and growth literature. And what I contribute here is I'm mostly extending models that do exist of, simple technology diffusion and multi-country models to have asymmetric economies and to have different levels of technologies and having multiple sectors and seeing if these models can give rise to tractable solutions for a technology diffusion model of growth and looking at what growth looks like in these asymmetric economies. All right, so I will jump into empirical evidence. So in the next few slides, I want to talk about multi-product plants and whether they are producing vertically linked products. But in order to do that, the first step is I have to define what relationships between products look like. So what I'm going to do is I construct a national input-output table using some finely defined input-output data. And then using that input-output table, I can then define vertical relationships between products. So here, I think most of you are familiar with this data. This is the annual manufacturing survey of industries in India. So what this has is plant level information on all the inputs used to produce all the outputs that within the plant. So I have detailed information on quantities of inputs used into the production of all the outputs that the firm does say it's producing. So using this plant level data, because I have input used and output produced, I can construct an input-output table myself from micro data and aggregate it up into a national input-output data set. Now, what is key about this data set is that this inputs and outputs are being, I forgot the word. The inputs and the outputs are actually defined using a product classification that is very fine in detail. So when I said leather and footballs, they go into much more detail where they're saying tanned leather and footballs in this particular, with using a specific type of leather versus not. So what this lets me do is I can aggregate these inputs into input-output pairs, and there are going to be close to 6,000 products in my data set, which means there are close to 36 million input-output pairs in the economy. So I want to show you some examples here. So as I said, tan leather and football. Using this input-output table, I can pick up any product pair, and then I can define whether one product within that pair is upstream or downstream to the other pair. So I know because tanned leather is used in the production of football, because I see input flow from tanned leather to football, leather is going to be upstream to football. And similarly, another example, if you take a desk with seat and a plywood board, desk is going to be downstream to plywood. And there are going to be a large fraction of these input-output pairs that are not vertically related at all in the data set. So what I've noticed is the finer you go in the data, the more finer information you have about products or industries in the economy, the fewer linkages you find in input-output structure. So out of these 33 million input-output pairs, close only about 0.2% of all these pairs are vertically linked, of all these input-output links are positively related, right? So there are very few product pairs that are potentially vertically linked. Now I want to emphasize this 0.2% because I'm going to come back to this number when I talk about the likelihood of plants adding new products and how I link back to this number.
Sorry to keep an introduction.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Are you going to define, how do you define it in the data? It seems like a non-trivial exercise to find these things, because firms use inputs, different sources. How do you?
So what I have is a firm lists all the outputs producing, but it also lists the quantities of different inputs it's using. So in the same classification. So I have a standard, I have that detailed micro data from this firm level. And what I do is I just aggregate up all these potential input-output linkages to the national level. These are pretty conservative linkages. So I do run some, checks to make sure I'm not picking up erroneous linkages. Sometimes firms just report wrong inputs.
Stuff.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those in the data. But it's just coming from firm information. What you should know
we can talk about it later. But
Yeah.
I was just puzzled how it is. I'm sure there are more input-output linkages than 0.1. But what makes it upstream and downstream? But
Okay, yeah. Here, so I should emphasize upstream and downstream is defined within a product pair. It is not independent of the product pair, right? Tanned leather here is upstream to football, but tanned leather would be downstream to just pure raw leather, right? So within a product pair, this definition of upstream is important.
But isn't it literally true that you just look at a football manufacturing firm and see that it listed tan leather as something it bought, and that lets you put upstream there in the third column?
Yes.
That you're just doing that with every single firm and every single product that firm is purchasing.
Yes.
And that always will give you upstream, right? I mean,
yes.
You're going to either say upstream or not, and then how would you ever get downstream? Oh, because then you're going to look at everything they sold.
Exactly. Yeah. Then there are also going to be leather producers in the economy, right? So where leather is their output, and then I see.
Yeah, and you'll see that they sold to a football manufacturer.
I don't have firm linkages, but I do have input-output linkages. So I just by definition, if leather is upstream to football, football has to be downstream to leather. This is by definition, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah, my question is,
you could take a plywood board manufacturer and see that it was selling to a desk seat or selling some desks. No, sorry. Okay. So
no. Okay. So, I see the confusion. So what I see.
How would you have gotten that piece of information?
Right. What I see is a desk manufacturer who's using inputs, one of which is a plywood board. So plywood board, yes.
Evidence all comes from the buying, a firm buying something.
Fair enough. Yes.
Not selling something.
Not selling. No, I don't have firm linkages to establish those links. Yeah. Yes.
My question is more of, at what point do you really define upstream or downstream? Because I'm sure your football manufacturers buy pens. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't normally classify pens as being upstream from football, right?
But, yeah.
So that was more of my question, is that you look at all these data and how do you define them?
So as I said, I'm going to be looking, I do use linkages that are, significant inputs into these productions. And so I do drop linkages that are super small in total input expenditure. There could be these random links, like maybe they do use a lot of pens in the production, and if those pens are to draw on the leather in order to cut them, that is an important input in my head. And when they're buying pens from their suppliers, are they interacting with their suppliers? Do these pen manufacturers learn that to produce a pen that is good enough to draw on leather has to be of a certain form, and then they might learn information through that. If it's an important enough linkage, it's in here. If it's not important, I do drop them. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. So I have these vertical relationships. So again, a vertical relationship is a product pair specific object. So between any two products, I can talk about the upstreamness and downstreamness of it. So the first stylized fact, so what I do with this vertical relationship data is I take them to the firm, and firms are going to have they're potentially multi-product producers in the economy. I look at all the products being produced by the plant, and I see if they're producing any pairs of products that are actually linked in the IO table. And then I classify firms accordingly. So the first part is there are a lot of single product plants, and we know a large fraction of plants are single product, but they capture a very small fraction of economic activity. The second part is multi-product plants, and this is where the literature has focused on. We know multi-product plants, even though there are few multi-product plants in the economy, they capture a large share of economic activity. So, here in India, it's close to 40% of plants are multi-product, producing 70% of output in the economy. Within multi-product plants is what I want to focus. There is a good amount of plants that are multi-product, which are actually multi-stage producers. And these seem to be even more important than the average multi-product producer. So they capture a bigger output share in the economy. So here, close to 43% of multi-product plants are multi-stage producers, and they capture 60% of multi-product output in the economy. And so that's basically me saying that within multi-product plants, there seems to be more important producers. Multi-stage producers seem to be playing an important role. There are some preliminary results I've been looking at which show that these multi-stage producers are actually producing a larger number of products compared to multi-product plants. They're also producing, and they capture a bigger revenue, and they're adding more value into the production processes. And they hire more workers in the economy. So this establishes multi-stage producers are different from an average multi-product producer. The second stylized fact is dynamic. So what I want to look at is whether firms are adding specific types of products over time. We know there is a lot of product turnover in the Indian manufacturing data. And what I find is every time a firm adds a new product, I look at what that product's relationship is to the previous production baskets. Right? And what I find is close to 40% of new products added are actually vertically related to these previous production baskets. Now, remember when I said that only 0.2% of all input-output links are vertical relationships, and I find here that close to 40% of new products added are vertically related. This seems to be a very disproportionate number given the potential products you could potentially add on to. So this is why I say they're disproportionately more likely to add vertically related products and become multi-stage producers over time, right? So just taking stock here. So given that plants are producing multiple stages in a value chain, and this is not just pure vertical integration, these are production of products for outside sale. And given that new stages are added over time, what is the question I come up with, the proposal I have here, my hypothesis is, why are plants adding these new stages of production? And could it be because they are coming in contact with this vertical knowledge because they are constantly interacting with their buyers and sellers? So here I want to test this hypothesis that there could be potential learning between buyers and sellers. And what I will be using is exogenous variation in export market access. that changes plants in Indian plants' access to foreign downstream technology. And I show that whenever there is this exogenous change to export market access, plants are more likely to introduce downstream products in the future. Right? And I'll run some other placebo tests and robustness checks to make sure it's not some other story that's driving these results. Okay, I didn't.
Can I stop
Yes,
you
Sam.
for a sec? I felt like you could do a little more on that earlier thing of saying, randomly, it's the firm is currently producing something. So really all it is of all the products that it could produce, how many of them are the ones that are linked to that particular product. So it's not really the proportion of bilaterals that are vertically.
So the average,
so conditional on what you're already producing, and then relative to all the universe of things you could possibly produce. I just wonder if you could do that a little more with kind of, okay, if it was random in a certain sense, what would we expect? And then here's what we see, which is dramatically different.
Yeah, no, okay, I don't have a full answer to that question, but I do have something. So what I have is out of the 6,000 products, the average product is linked to 7 or 8 products. Yeah. The average product is linked to 7 or 8 products. Now 7 is 0.2% of all 6,000 products. That's where the number is coming from. Yeah. What I can do, which I'm planning to do, is look at the distribution of these linkages across products. Is a product that's more linked more likely to add these vertical products or not? So I can actually look at the differences across products as well. That's okay, where was I? Right, so identifying knowledge diffusion. Here, what I'm interested in is knowing whether a firm is introducing a new downstream product in the future. So in order to define that, I just get the set of downstream products to any given product in the economy. And this is what I say, the average set D of omega has 7 products in it. Planned J set of new products, I define it as whatever it's producing today, the intersection of that from yesterday's, removing that, all the new products in the plant's production basket today is what I'll be looking at. And I'll see within this new product basket that a plant is producing, if any of them are vertically related, if any of them fall into this D of omega set from my previous production basket. Okay, so this my regression variable, the main variable I'm interested in, is just a dummy variable. It's going to take the value 1 if a plant expands downstream in the future, and 0 if it doesn't. The measure of and what I want to see focus on is whether exposure of Indian plants to foreign markets increases the likelihood of this downstream expansion. So something I should emphasize here is, a caveat in the data is I do not observe plant level export status. So I don't know whether plants are exporting outside or not. So what I use here instead is aggregate India level export sales of a particular product. So this is going to give me an average effect across all plants, even though I cannot observe plant level export status. So this export market access term, export exposure measure, I constructed with two different variables. The first one is how much is India exporting a certain product to outside countries. So say we're looking at leather. India, a large fraction of Indian producers are leather producers. And we know India is exporting leather to multiple countries, say Italy and Ethiopia. So this is going to capture the extent of exposure these firms have to each of these countries' manufacturers of footballs. The second measure is a measure that's going to capture how good each of these countries are in the production of downstream products. So we have Italy and Ethiopia. We also know Italy possibly produces football. I don't know. And there's Ethiopia who could be potentially producing footballs. Now, I want to capture how good Italy is in the production of footballs versus Ethiopia. And that needs to be in here because I want to know the knowledge that Indian producers have access to in each of these countries. And this is going to be a relative per capita exports from each of these countries to the outside world of these downstream products, of the set of downstream products. And it's a standard linear probability model where I look at whether this downstream expansion can respond to this export exposure measure.
Is the per capita important there when you do it without?
So
I have. The other country has a big hub of football production. Why does it matter what the rest of the country or where the country borders are?
So I have used other measures like just share of world supply of these downstream products coming from, and the results are similar. I mean, the estimates do change. They're not the same as levels, but the results are pretty standard. I want, because there's this China supplying a large amount of I don't want to pick up everything exactly. So I want to know relative to their labor force if they are pretty good producers of a certain product or not. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and obvious endogeneity concerns with this export exposure measure. You can think of India becoming really good at producing a certain value chain. So it's becoming good at producing leather and footballs at the same time. So exports of leather goes up, but also production of football goes up. A more important concern in this data seems to be, think of supply shocks to upstream products. So in something in India changes how profitable it is for you to produce leather. And that makes you, increase exports to the rest of the world. But there is this negative correlation in the data between whether I produce a new product tomorrow, a new downstream product tomorrow, and whether I keep producing the old product in my basket. So if I start producing football, do I keep leather in my basket or not? And there seems to be a pretty significant negative correlation between the two. So if this means that if I want to start producing football, I need to give up the production of leather, which is very profitable for me. And that's going to drive my results downwards. So there's going to be a negative bias in my OLS estimates. So, sorry. Oops. So
Can I ask a question, kind of, sorry, it's sort of stepping back a little bit, but what was pushing you to think about it from downstream rather than the firm importing and starting to produce upstream? And that example of that recently we were just hearing about was China producing its own chips. Well, that may be partly for security issues or whatever, but still that is definitely going upstream from some producer of
that's a great question, and I did try to look at that. There are like caveats in the data that I couldn't pick up this effect. So first, I do have whether firms are importing certain inputs, but because these, right, so, okay, first thing, I did not find results there. So I did look at whether, inputs of firms' inputs makes this firm more likely to start producing these inputs by itself. Now, because if this input is being produced for firms' own, consumption, this input is not listed as an output for these factories. So it could be because I'm not finding results because of the data, the caveats in the data where they don't list these outputs if they're using it for their own consumption. Or it could be that they're not learning about input production. So I cannot differentiate whether the effect's going either way. Yeah. They could just be pure vertically integrated firms. And I've been thinking about doing, using these measures of vertical distance between inputs and outputs to kind of capture that, but that's work in progress.
On Sam's other question, similarly, how about other related products that are not necessarily vertically integrated, but firms that make shirts may be more likely to make pants or different types of steel?
Right, so you're talking about this
something that's common for multi-product firms to produce these subsets, right? These
that's like the paper by Swati Dhingra and Bohm and Morrow, I think. So they have this whether input complementarity is a big deal about multi-product plants, right? So they look at past product input mix and whether that input mix is you're more likely to produce products that uses the same type of input mix. And there is a lot of evidence for that. I don't want to, I'm not saying that that's not a story in the data. I'm saying that apart from input complementarity, there seems to be these vertical nature linkages also that matters. And this is just, again, bringing in this new dimension for these multi-product firm existence. Why do they exist? We don't know yet completely, I think. Okay, so the instrumental variable strategy that I use here is using foreign countries' import demand shocks to explain India's exports to these countries. So this is, again, my IV will look exactly, the construction of the IV is very similar to the construction of my export exposure measure, but instead of using exports, I'm going to be using foreign countries' import demand to explain these exports. I'll jump into my first set of results. As I said, the OLS, it could be positively biased or negatively biased. The first endogeneity concern I raised would make the OLS positively biased. The second one would negatively bias the results. Here it looks like the negative bias seems to be pretty strong. My IV results gives you strong positive estimates. So this number will tell me a doubling of this export exposure measure increases the probability, the likelihood that a plant expands downstream by 3.5 percentage points. And that's a big number. I think I was explaining this earlier. I think the average number for this downstream expansion is 15% in the data. So 3.5 percentage points is a comparatively good number here. So the third column here is controlling for world demand shocks of these downstream products. So another major concern is India is exporting leather, but that's probably coming from an increased demand for footballs all over the world. That makes Indian producers likely to start producing footballs as well to capture these markets. So here, what I'm going to impute a demand for Indian footballs that's coming from all over the world, and I control for this measure. So for this specific regression, world demand does not matter, but when I look at over time specifications, world demand does matter. So world demand for footballs does drive Indian producers to start producing footballs. So the second here, this is what I was saying. That was the first set of regressions was just looking at one period in advance. Here I'm looking at whether this effect remains over time. So 2 years down the line and 3 years down the line. I don't want to seriously compare these estimates across these specifications because my observation set is changing over time because this is an unbalanced panel of firms. But there seems to be some evidence that this effect could be stronger if you give more time for firms to internalize whatever they're potentially learning by exporting. Now the last this set of results is for if we are still skeptical, why is it, what is special about downstream products? Is it just export market opportunities increasing profits within the firm that makes it more likely for this firm to have capital to start investing and producing new products? Now here what I do is I look at whether a firm starts producing other types of products in the economy. And the first 3 columns are whether it produces upstream products, in response to an export exposure measure. And there seems to be no effect whatsoever. They're like zero, pretty, they're around, the estimates are around 0. And the last 3 columns are other unrelated products in the economy. Remember, firms do add a bunch of other unrelated products, not vertically related. And again, unrelated products, even though they capture pretty big 60% of all new products added are unrelated products, I don't see them responding to export exposure measures. So that I will stop my empirical section there. I have 20 minutes that I do want to show you my model. There are a bunch of robustness checks. So this, I'll show you this one where I look at a measure of exports only. So this is where, remember, my export exposure measure was a combination of 2 things, the weights and the exports. Now, if I remove these weights, does it still matter? So it looks like, yes, exports do matter for downstream expansion, but these estimates are much smaller and much noisier when compared to the export exposure measure with the weights in there. So where it's not just how much you're selling outside that matters, it does matter where you sell them to. Are you selling your products to countries which are actually good at producing these downstream products? And that's what's driving most of my results in my baseline estimates.
So can I ask a question about this? I mean, so
yes.
how do we really know this is about knowledge diffusion? Like you showed me some stuff, and I will admit that it's suggestive, but I mean, is there, I mean, and you told some alternative story about, I guess, this slide right here, but
Yeah.
what else, is there anything else we should be thinking about? Or, I mean, the other thing that came up, because on your slides, one slide said knowledge diffusion, another slide said learning. And that got me thinking about learning about demand kind of stuff, Dorian stuff. And so like, what's the, like, is there anything that we can do to know it's precisely about diffusion of knowledge, or is it something broader? Or
I don't have a very good answer to that. So I've tried to, run some regressions that will say that shows that it's not these other potential stories. And that's what I have. I do run these exercises where I look at whether firm level characteristics are changing before these new additions of products happen. So what I see is there seems to be not a large significant difference between, say, capital accumulation or expenditure on inputs that changes when firms add different types of products. But export exposure measure affects only these downstream expansion measures.
And do you have a measure of productivity, like firm performance or something?
I could get measures of productivity, but there are, I could, for multi-product firms, it can I could get a firm level productivity, but not by product.
Yeah.
Or Mike, don't you think just profitability? Because then you could say, well, look, they're making more money. So if they knew how to do it before, that was kind of crazy. It must be some technological improvement or something.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, is something that kind of gets to the closer to the black box we wanna see. I mean,
Right,
going back to Sam, go ahead.
So sorry, one thing is when they add vertically related products, especially downstream products, their value added increases. Measures of value added in the plant increases, and that could be one of the reasons why they're interested in adding vertically related products than other products. Now the question is, why is it responding to export exposure measures? And that's what I want to emphasize here. Export exposure seems to expand, makes them more likely to do this. And that could be because they're learning something, they're learning about product production, or they could be just learning about demand. And that is okay for me, because I don't want to be specific about what it is learning, but that probably does have implications for what the model should look like.
That's value added per worker.
Value added total, but I could look. That's a good point.
Because that's the crudest measure of productivity, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I just want to quickly take stock. We have these empirical facts about multi-stage producers and probably some causal evidence for these international knowledge spillovers that makes firms add these new stages. And in the next few slides, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the dynamic model of innovation and growth that I have. And then we'll talk about what contributions of knowledge spillovers look like and what trade dynamics, what the impact of trade policy on firm dynamics is. So this model is going to have asymmetric economies and multiple industries. Within each industry, I'm going to make production a little stylized and say there is an upstream stage of production, downstream stage of production. And within each of these states, there are multiple varieties being produced in each of these industries. Firms are going to be multi-product and multi-stage producers, and they're going to add products into their baskets by innovating, and this is going to take the form in Clet and Cottam of innovating firms. And then I will combine all of this and close the model using a model of growth from dynamic selection, like in Sampson's and Perla Antonetti's models, wherein I assume I put some restrictions on the distribution of productivities in the economy, and I assume them to be Pareto, and show that with growth, the productivity distribution stays Pareto. So just the production structure of the economy. As I said, within each industry, there's going to be an upstream stage. There are multiple varieties in the upstream stage, and all these varieties get aggregated up into a material input. And then they're going to be used in the production of downstream varieties, and the downstream varieties are then used in the final good production, which is called Douglas. Firms are going to be, producing varieties across upstream and downstream stages. So when you pick a firm can be producing any combination of varieties within an industry across upstream and downstream. So just to give you some examples, some illustrations of what firms look like in the economy, here firm 1 is a single stage producer, which is producing an upstream variety. Firm 2 is a single stage producer, who is producing a downstream variety. Firm 3 are the interesting guys. These are the multi-stage producers. These are multi-product, multi-stage producers who are producing each variety, one variety in each of these stages. And firm 4 would be a standard multi-product producer. So why this is important for me, I want to link this back to what I see in the data, the types of different types of firms that I see in the data. The model can produce those distributions using this innovation and entry and exit assumptions.
And so are firm types fixed, or they're stochastically moving through?
They're moving, and I'll show you how the firms would transition. Now, firms can expand this product portfolio that they have by investing in R&D. So R&D is going to be, there are two different types of R&D. So say for each product that a firm produces in a given stage, say a firm is producing leather, the leather product will let the firm invest in two types of R&D activities. One is there's an on-stage investment and a cross-stage investment. On-stage investment on-stage R&D is important for me to get these multi-product producers who are not multi-stage. So what this lets them do is add new varieties within their same stage. So say a firm can innovate, try to introduce new products in the upstream stage like synthetic fiber. Cross-stage R&D is key in this model. So this is what is going to make firms introduce cross-stage products, another stage of production and become multi-stage. So here a firm could try to learn about footballs because football is downstream to leather. And it's going to be able to do this by investing in cross-stage R&D, but R&D itself is going to be, firms are going to be able to learn from who they sell and buy to. So here, for example, if a leather producer is a domestic supplier to domestic football makers, the knowledge this leather supplier has access to is just domestic football makers. Now, if this leather supplier is going to be an exporter, there's going to be an exporting premium attached to this guy. So if he's exporting to good countries, good producers of footballs outside, he's going to access all the knowledge outside of his domestic economy. Just quickly, what this R&D looks like. R&D here is going to take a simple form. Firms are going to choose the Poisson arrival rate of ideas for each of these types of innovations. And they're going to invest in this cost function. And the cost function is going to depend on knowledge spillovers. So there's going to be this ratio. Cost is going to be high, cost will be low the more knowledge you have access to. So if an exporter is accessing better knowledge outside of his country, his R&D costs are going to be lower than a pure domestic producer who's accessing lower knowledge within the country. And what these knowledge spillovers do is just increase the rate at which firms are able to produce new ideas. New successful ideas that firms get are going to be increasing in the extent of knowledge spillovers in the economy. Now, once they have an idea, the simplifying feature in the model is that new innovations are going to be drawn from existing incumbent distributions. And this is what keeps the model tractable. This is like in Sampson's papers or Pearl Antonetti's papers where, entrants are going to, growth is because of entry and dynamic selection. But once there is an entrant in the model, they draw ideas from the existing incumbent distribution in the economy. Okay. So here is where the firm transitions, what transitions look like. So an upstream producer, a single product plant who used to produce an upstream stage, can gain a successful innovation through these cross-stage innovations, through cross-stage R&D efforts, and become a multi-stage producer in the next period. So that firm 1 is transitioning from single product to a multi-stage producer. Firm 2 is investing in own stage R&D, is getting a successful own stage innovation, and he's becoming he's transitioning from single stage to multi-product, but not multi-stage. And there are going to be other combinations of these transitions. There's also going to be firm entry in the model where a new firm could enter and enter into each of these states of productions and start off as a single product producer. I have 9 minutes. I could, as I said, I close this model by using these dynamic by looking at growth through a lens of dynamic selection. So what I have here is growth is going to move the productivity distribution of varieties in the economy to the right. And the extent of growth is going to depend on first these knowledge spillovers. How quickly are you able to draw these ideas, and the existing incumbent distribution. If you already have a good distribution in the economy, you're going to have faster growth. If your distribution is slower because new ideas are being drawn from this average distribution, the growth is going to be a little less. I'll jump into the model implications. So here what I'm doing is calibrating the model to a balanced growth path equilibrium. So I'm just going to restrict it to India and the rest of the world aggregate. And then look at the manufacturing sector and divide them up into upstream and downstream stages, depending on what fraction of their output is being consumed by final producers versus as intermediate inputs. There's a bunch of externally calibrated parameters. I do have a Pareto parameter that has to be estimated because I have assumptions in the model that say I will assume the distribution of productivities in each of these stages to be Pareto, and then growth will make sure it's going to stay Pareto. So the Pareto parameter I calibrate through structural gravity equations that come out of the model. And then I have trade and variable trade costs and fixed trade costs. We also have exogenous exit in the model, which I'm going to be calibrating to the exit rate of large firms in the data. This is a more important part of the calibration, which is what do these innovation cost parameters look like for these firms? And I'm going to be matching transition moments of firm types to what I see in the data. So incumbent on stage innovation parameters will be matched to see what I find in the data where single product plants are becoming multi-product plants and not multi-stage. And then when I see single product plants becoming multi-stage producers, I match that moment to calibrate cross-stage R&D parameters in the economy. Okay, so the first thing is contribution of these knowledge spillovers. So as I said, this is a growth model through dynamic selection. So anything that changes your threshold quality is going to change the growth rates in the economy, because new ideas, the average quality of new ideas drawn depends on the incumbent distribution. So this is a comparison of economies across balanced growth paths with these vertical spillovers and one without vertical spillovers. What I find is vertical spillovers, the growth rate in the the welfare in the vertical spillover case is slightly smaller when compared to an economy without these vertical spillovers. And that's mostly coming up because incumbent firms in the economy are trading off between today's profits to future option value of producing new products. So remember that just producing a product gives you the option of innovating tomorrow. So existing in the market lets you innovate in the economy, which means the effective fixed costs of staying in the market, of production in the market, are reducing in the economy, which means it reduces the quality thresholds of all the firms that exist in the market, effectively reducing the average productivity in the economy and then reducing growth through it. So the growth through dynamic selection models have this feature because the minute you have fixed costs involved in the equilibrium, anything that changes the fixed costs, like the option value of future innovations, is going to change the productivity distribution in equilibrium. But I should emphasize that technology gaps do reduce in the spillovers case. Technology gaps between a frontier economy and a laggard economy are much smaller when there are more knowledge spillovers. In this trade policy counterfactuals, what I want to look at is what firm dynamics look like. Remember, these are balanced growth path BGP comparisons, and I haven't worked out the transition paths yet. What I find is obviously whenever there is opened up economies are much closer in technology levels across countries. So gaps between in a free trade economy is half that of a completely ordered case in this calibrated version. Now, if there is a trade protectionist policy, these gaps can diverge a lot more. So gaps can increase by 50% or 60% if countries close off their economies to trade. And technology gaps do converge both upstream and downstream. Now, this does have an impact on how much knowledge spillovers exist for firms to learn from, because gaps in technology is what essentially pinpoints, or in my model, the extent of knowledge spillovers depend on technology gaps between domestic and foreign economies. So this last slide, I'm going to show you what firm distributions look like. And these are distributions of these types of firms that I started talking about at the beginning of the talk. There are single product firms and multi-stage producers and multi-product producers. And the lower knowledge spillovers there are, the fewer options for firms to learn from each other. So the fraction of firms that are multi-stage reduces in a case where technology gaps are smaller. So here in a trade protectionist case, the multi-product, multi-stage producers have increased by 50%, because even though there is lesser trade between economies, the few producers who are exporting and interacting with these better producers outside are learning a lot. They're getting this kick out of interacting with these foreign producers who are so much more better than their domestic counterparts. And in a trade liberalization case, because knowledge has diffused and technology gaps have converged, the share of multi-stage producers goes down slightly because there is less options for firms to learn from each other. I will end there, and I'll conclude by saying that this paper, I think, sorry, was there a question? Okay, so I'll conclude by saying that there is I'm documenting new evidence about a new dimension of multi-stage, multi-product producers. So I'm saying vertical relationships between products are important, and I do want to dig deeper into what's the details about how these vertical producers exist, why they exist, and so there is some plausible evidence for learning between these between producers or between agents in a transaction for such existence. It could be the reason that there is knowledge flowing between buyers and sellers, and that leads to these multi-stage producers. Growth and welfare impacts, as I said, it really depends on the type of model you write. In a model with these dynamic selection effects, incumbent innovation, or these knowledge spillovers that incumbent firms can benefit from, does in fact reduce growth slightly. And we should think about the long-term adjustment of technology gaps between countries to talk about knowledge diffusion. So the extent of knowledge diffusion does depend on the gaps of technologies between countries, and that has implications for firm dynamics in the model. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll leave the stream open and take questions and comments.
Swapnika, I had a quickly thinking about this last part of your talk. I wonder if there's a way you can do something in the aggregate that's a little more about India, maybe less ambitious in some sense, but sort of more taking the rest of the world as given, or thinking of the rest of the world as maybe Europe, the developed countries. So it's India versus them, and it's more about, not about world growth, but really just about India catching up. So it's still pretty ambitious, but it's kind of not as many things endogenous, so that you're kind of closer in the GE models, a little closer to your data, and it's really about a kind of, India opening up. How much more of a kick do you get than you would have had these linkages not been, these extra new products downstream hadn't been coming about.
Okay. I guess you have picked up on the disconnect, right, between the empirics and what I'm trying to show in the model.
I'm kind of trying to
Yeah.
pull
Yeah.
that closer.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. The another point is the model is I'm comparing balanced growth path equilibria. So I'm looking at not transition dynamics, which is what the data is more closely talking about, but BGP analysis. So if the transition dynamic, I'm trying to solve the transition dynamics, and maybe that could help me link it back to the empirics a lot more.
And a question would be, could you do the transition dynamics holding fixed everybody else?
I could, yeah, that is a good point.
It might make it simpler and kind of make less things going on.
That's a very good point. Yes, I should do that. Yeah.
George, go ahead, please. I talked too much.
No, I was just going to kind of second Sam's point. I mean, I know Tim Keogh's not here. He usually likes general equilibrium. So I think it's, in some sense, I'd love it if you could kind of go back and like look at India when they did have their trade liberalization, and then afterwards, and sort of see if like the changes in the way firms are growing is somehow consistent.
Yeah.
So I kind of like more to the micro side of it.
I guess the what I was trying to go for in this exercise is, say India was autarky back in 80s and early 90s, and then it opens up to a baseline economy. So this baseline to autarky is that comparison. The problem here is these are balanced growth path comparisons. So I'm not getting those, nice firm transitions. What are firms doing within this transition period, which is what the data, if you look at the data, that's what's the most interesting part of it is. Yeah.
So let me third Sam's point and propose a very simple model, just to try to understand what you're getting at with this particular model. So suppose firms in the small open economy, India and the rest of the world, have two productivities, one to produce upstream, one to produce downstream. We open up for trade. So far, we only produce upstream because we haven't made the cutoff. And then we learn, and productivity to produce downstream starts to go up. And maybe it goes up slowly. So for some firms, take a little longer to enter the downstream market. So that gets at the facts, right? Mm-hmm. You seem to want something more from the model. So I missed kind of that motivation, because just the facts, it's very simple, right? That there are two types of goods you produce, and you're going to learn about one. And so it goes up and we get at those reduced form regressions, right?
I think I should say, when I started this project, I was my motivation was coming from, can I write down a model with asymmetric economies with knowledge diffusion that's tractable, and I can like talk about growth and other aggregate implications. That's where the motivation started. So I have this crazy model that's trying to do this, do modeling tricks. And then I realized I do have this data that I can use to, talk about some of these features in the model. So I see where this is coming from, and I should probably take a step back and see what I can cut down in the model and what is essential to keep in.
Or the other way, right? Go to the data and try to seek more implications that you had
that I could
model and that you hadn't thought about, perhaps would justify the features.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just come back to that again. I mean, I couldn't quite tell if you had done this or not, but there's some industries that are pretty open and some industries that are pretty closed. Mm-hmm. And so to what extent does your model sort of capture the growth path of those firms and industries that are pretty closed versus firms and industries that are pretty open when they kind of get involved?
I did not do that. So here I have like a single industry. The model is tractable enough for me to have multiple industries. I could do that.
Yeah. The difference is always kind of a helpful test of the mechanism in some sense.
Yeah. So that those counterfactuals can be done, but if you just going back to India's liberalization episode, by 2000s, almost all industries were pretty open. They might have started at different levels, but trade tariff levels were pretty low for all industries. But that's an interesting counterfactual analysis to do across industry analysis. Yeah.
But even if the tariff levels are pretty low, I mean, India has more of a comparative advantage in some industries than other industries.
Yes.
And there's different industries,
yes.
you know, different productivity dynamics that would sort of lead, like export participation or export intensity to be very different. So.
Right. I guess you're trying to bring to point like these features where openness matters for knowledge diffusion, and comparative advantage determines what openness looks like, and that changes knowledge. Yeah, patterns of knowledge diffusion. Yes, that's a good point. Yes.
Looking at heterogeneity more generally in the empirics would be super interesting. So what types of industry are they more likely to go downstream to? Is it more skill intensive, more complex, differentiated? And then the same at the firm level, are they ex ante larger firms, smaller firms, so who knows, right?
Yeah.
Just to try to get a little bit more meat into what types of the facts, into the facts.
I have preliminary evidence for some of what you're saying. I am digging into that now. So bigger firms are more likely to introduce more products. That is one of the features in the data. Industry heterogeneity, there does exist industry heterogeneity. So not all industry, you can't learn downstream production in all industries. It doesn't make sense, right? So there are some industries that are more likely to introduce downstream products in response to export exposure measure. Something I want to show you is in the empirics, in the presence of multi-stage producers is pretty consistent across all industries. There seems to be the similar shares of firms across industries that are multi-stage producers, but when it comes to response to export exposure measures across industries, it's only a few ones that do respond, like chemicals or plastics, leather and textiles. So these are places where you see a lot more possibilities for downstream expansion because you're interacting with foreign producers. And things like oil production or like coal and transportation engines, this is not something that you see a lot of downstream expansion, which is neat. I think I'm going to be digging more into those details. And also firm characteristics or input just within an industry. What type of product are you producing? Like, is it a product that is differentiated or not? And how many other products can it be used for? Is it a very specific product or is it a common product? Hopefully I'll find some exciting results there that can answer Michael's question as to is there something else that you can tell me that is actually knowledge diffusion and not that's learning and not just something else in the company. Yeah.
I was a bit.
Isn't there? Oh, sorry, Drew. Oh, I was thinking, Swapnika, that there's a data set out there that tells you which Indian firms are exporting, right? It might only be of the bigger firms. Doesn't start with like Progressa or no, it's not that, but it starts with a
Provis. Provis, right? Yeah. So this is being recorded. Okay. Provis is good, but the nice thing about ASI is the product definitions.
But can you? There's no way to merge them.
I'm going to be losing detail. What I do have is I'm using data only up to 2010, and I don't have export measures there. But after 2010, the ASI does collect whether the firm is exporter or not. But the problem is it changes product classifications after 2010, and it becomes a little messy to merge these. Even within the same data set, product classification merging, I lose a lot of information. So I was reluctant to do that, but I could do something with that. Yeah, that is something. The fact that I observe 6,000 different products is just mind-boggling for the type of analysis I want to do here. Yeah. So,
I was a bit sort of surprised about the direction in which you took the model. I was sort of expecting that, there's people talk about diffusion, where diffusion you learn by buying. And then you provided this evidence, which seemed to be at least consistent, if not conclusive, that, you could have a channel that's learning by selling rather than learning by buying. And that I thought you were going to take the model in that direction to say, look, I see this, at least something that's consistent with the learning by selling, and let me talk about a diffusion where that's the direction. But it went by a bit fast. I didn't see where your diffusion was coming from, buying, selling, or both. But
so I have both features in there. So I have this feature of diffusion where importing lets you learn from the products that are being sold in your country. So here on stage R&D, or whenever a new entrant enters the market, this is a pretty common feature in most of these knowledge diffusion models. These entrants or new or incumbents doing on stage R&D learn from all other sellers in that stage. I could restrict that, but this is where importing will let you learn. The cross-stage R&D is where selling matters. So if you're an upstream producer, who you sell to matters for how much you can learn from them. So there are flavors of both types of knowledge diffusion in this model.
Now, since that was something new, I thought that was something you were going to emphasize, and then you didn't emphasize it. It seemed that was kind of there's kind of many models out there of learning by buying, but the learning by selling seems
so
a little bit different.
I guess what I did emphasize at the end of the day, which is, what is the contribution of these vertical knowledge spillovers in these standard models where, entrants can learn from these knowledge spillovers, where, you can learn from either the products being sold there, sold in your country, or produced in your country. More diffusion means more growth. And this here, because vertical knowledge spillovers affects by definition only the incumbents in the model, and incumbent innovation changes for this dynamic selection features. That's why I was focusing on these contribution of these vertical knowledge spillovers. It's pretty different from a standard entry model where entrants can learn from other producers or sellers. But because incumbents are doing the innovation in a model of dynamic selection, incumbent innovation changes these distribution patterns. And that's why I was focusing on this thing.
And there are a lot of papers on learning by exporting, right? That was the original Bernard and Jensen motivation.
Yes,
yeah, but not the models, no? I mean,
that's true. That's true. Fair enough.
Yeah.
There is, I don't know if it's quite right, but just it's worth a quick look. There's this guy, Eric von Hippel, who, I don't even know if he's alive anymore because I was reading him when I was a graduate student, but he was really into the knowledge diffusion between a buyer and the seller. And he was very much of the style of case study, which would be kind of nice in this.
Yeah.
And I think he has a book. So he was at Sloan School at MIT, but you could just look up I think he has some famous books about.
Yeah, case studies would be great.
I'm sure he does. I don't know. Maybe they're not that famous, but anyway, they exist.
I usually give this example of Bangladesh and textile industry where, it started off as a cotton producer supplying cotton to the fashion industry, but now has integrated multiple parts of the fashion industry value chain and now produces the final good, including packaging and selling everything by the country. So that's one of my case study examples that I usually use.
Yeah.
But this is good. I should. So, but going back to, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your first name, Dorian.
Darren.
Going back to her point, so I want to say these are BGP comparisons, and these should not be comparing across BGPs. But if you think about a transition dynamics in this setting, what I expect to find is when firms open up, there are the standard diffusions, but these vertical spillovers, what they're going to do is increase the likelihood that firms are going to expand in a multi-stage manner initially. once knowledge, when economies open up to trade, technology gaps are wide enough that they're able to draw a lot of ideas from each other. And the fraction of firms innovating cross stage is going to go up, and then slowly adjust and go, and converge to some balanced growth path level. So those are the dynamics that I'm interested in, that I'm hoping that can work out.
I had just one measurement concern in that, you measure the stages only if I'm, selling some of the first stage, that I'm not using all of my first stage output. You could have a whole bunch of guys who are producing stages 1 and 2, but since they use all of stage 1 as an input into stage 2, you consider them only a stage 2 producer. It's like the boundaries of the firm basically dictate how you sort of measure.
That is one of the restrictions here. I guess I could, there are two different concerns that I could look at single product producers, and I know single product producers are vertically integrated to different extents. I know they're using different sets of inputs, so they're doing more inputs within in-house versus out-house. Then the question is, okay, there I can differentiate between, okay, maybe these guys are producing some of the inputs, I'll call these multi-stage producers, let's say, for simplicity's sake. But I don't know how to do that for multi-stage producers. Potentially, there are going to be a lot of multi-stage producers who are producing inputs in-house, but that's going to be a lot more tricky for me to differentiate because I don't see input use by product line there. So that is another, I take your point. So this is conditional on how I'm classifying these firms as upstream, downstream, and multi-stage producers. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Stop the recording, George.